Karoline Leavitt was no stranger to challenges. At just 27 years old, she had already built a reputation as a fearless journalist, with a knack for asking tough questions and standing her ground. Her rise in the media world wasn't overnight. It was the result of countless late nights, endless research, and an unrelenting drive to make a difference. People admired her for her sharp mind, but what truly set her apart was her ability to connect with others. She didn't talk at people, she spoke with them, and now, she was about to face one of the biggest moments of her career. The invitation came unexpectedly, a chance to appear on The Daily Show, hosted by none other than Jon Stewart. For decades, Stewart had been a household name, known for his razor-sharp wit, insightful commentary, and ability to break down complex issues into digestible bits of satire. To many, sitting across from him felt like stepping into the lion's den. But Karoline saw it differently. To her, this wasn't just another TV appearance. It was an opportunity to share her perspective with millions of viewers. The topic: a controversial policy proposal that had sparked heated debates nationwide. It was a subject she knew inside out, and she wasn't going to let anyone intimidate her, not even Jon Stewart. Preparation was key. Karoline spent days poring over documents, revisiting interviews, and refining her arguments. She knew Stewart wouldn't pull any punches, he never did. His style was to mix humor with hard-hitting questions, often leaving guests scrambling to keep up. But Karoline wasn't worried. If anything, she welcomed the challenge. She understood that the best way to win over an audience wasn't just through facts but through authenticity. So instead of memorizing rehearsed lines, she focused on understanding the heart of the issue and why it mattered to everyday people. By the time she walked into the studio, she felt ready. Or so she thought. The atmosphere backstage was electric. Crew members rushed around making last-minute adjustments while producers gave final instructions. Karoline took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was there. This wasn't about scoring points or proving who was smarter. It was about sparking meaningful conversations. As she stepped onto the set, the bright lights momentarily blinded her, but the sound of the live audience cheering brought her back to the moment. Jon Stewart greeted her warmly, shaking her hand with a firm grip and flashing his trademark grin. "You ready for this?" he asked casually, though there was a glint of mischief in his eyes. Karoline smiled back, her voice steady. "Absolutely." The opening segment went smoothly. Stewart introduced Karoline, highlighting her accomplishments, and teasing the debate ahead with his usual charm. The audience laughed at his jokes, setting a light-hearted tone. But as they moved into the discussion, the mood shifted. Stewart began with a seemingly innocent question, but it quickly became clear that he was testing her. Each follow-up question was sharper than the last, designed to probe weaknesses in her argument. He poked fun at some of the data she cited, suggesting it might be cherry-picked. The audience chuckled nervously, sensing the tension building, but Karoline didn't flinch. Instead of reacting defensively, she leaned forward, her expression calm yet determined. She explained the source of the statistic, breaking it down in simple terms that anyone could understand. Then, with a slight smile, she turned the tables. "I appreciate your skepticism," she said, her tone respectful but firm. "But if we're talking about accuracy, maybe we should also look at how oversimplification can sometimes lead to misinformation, even unintentionally." The room fell silent for a split second before erupting into applause. It was a bold move, and everyone knew it. Jon Stewart raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed despite himself. This was only the beginning. What started as a routine interview was quickly turning into something far more intense and far more captivating. For Karoline, it wasn't just about defending her position. It was about showing that she could hold her own against one of the sharpest minds in the business. And, for the audience, it was becoming clear that they were witnessing something special. Jon Stewart wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not on his own show. Over the years, he had built a reputation for dismantling arguments with ease, often leaving guests scrambling to keep up. But Karoline Leavitt was different. She didn't shy away from his pointed questions or witty remarks. Instead, she met him head-on, matching his energy and even turning some of his jokes back on him. It was clear that she wasn't there to simply survive the interview. She was there to make her voice heard. The debate grew more intense as Stewart pressed further. He leaned back in his chair, his signature smirk playing on his lips, and said, "All right, let's talk about this policy again. You've made your case, but isn't it a little optimistic? Some might say naive." The audience chuckled, expecting Karoline to stumble under the weight of his critique. But instead she smiled, a calm, confident smile that seemed to say, "I've been waiting for this moment." "Well," she began, her tone steady and measured, "optimism isn't a bad thing, especially when we're talking about solving problems that affect millions of people. Sure, skepticism has its place, it keeps us honest. But if we only focus on what could go wrong, we miss opportunities to make things better. And that's where hope comes in. Hope pushes us to try, even when the odds seem stacked against us." Her words hung in the air for a moment, and you could almost hear the gears turning in the audience's minds. They weren't just listening anymore, they were thinking. Stewart, however, wasn't ready to let her off the hook. "Fair point," he admitted, nodding slightly. "But hope without action is just wishful thinking, right? What makes you think this policy will actually work?" Karoline didn't hesitate. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his, and said, "Because it's already working, in small ways, yes, but it's working. Look at the communities that have implemented similar ideas. Crime rates are down, trust in local governments is up, and people feel safer. It's not perfect, and no policy ever is, but it's a start. Isn't that worth pursuing?" Stewart raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "A start, huh? So you're saying we should gamble on something that's still unproven on a larger scale?" His tone was playful, but there was a seriousness behind his words. This was the kind of question that could trip up even the most seasoned debaters. But Karoline didn't falter. "I wouldn't call it gambling," she replied, her voice firm but warm. "I'd call it investing, in people, in our future. Every big change starts somewhere. The New Deal, civil rights legislation, healthcare reform, they all faced resistance. At first, people doubted them, called them unrealistic. But look how far we've come because someone decided to take that first step." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers filling the studio. For many of them, this wasn't just a theoretical discussion anymore. It was personal. Karoline's words resonated deeply, reminding them of the power of persistence and belief in progress. Even Stewart seemed momentarily taken aback by the strength of her response. He tilted his head, studying her with newfound respect. "Okay," he said finally, his tone lighter but still probing. "Let's shift gears for a second. You've talked a lot about the policy itself, but what about the politics behind it? Critics say it's divisive, that it pits one group against another. How do you respond to that?" Karoline paused, choosing her words carefully. She knew this was a sensitive topic, one that required tact and honesty. "It's true that change can be uncomfortable," she admitted. "And yes, some people will resist it because they're afraid of what it might mean for them. But here's the thing. Progress isn't about division. It's about inclusion. It's about bringing everyone to the table, listening to their concerns, and finding solutions that work for the majority. Does that mean everyone will agree? No. But it's better than doing nothing and letting fear dictate our decisions." Her answer struck a chord with the audience. A few people nodded in agreement while others whispered to their neighbors, clearly moved by her perspective. Stewart, too, seemed impressed, though he wasn't ready to concede just yet. "That sounds good in theory," he countered. "But how do you get people to actually sit down and listen to each other? In today's world, it feels like everyone's shouting and nobody's hearing." Karoline smiled knowingly, as if she had anticipated this question all along. "You're absolutely right. It's not easy," she said. "But it starts with leadership. Leaders have to set the tone, show that compromise isn't weakness, and remind people that we're all in this together. It's not going to happen overnight, but every conversation counts. Every effort to understand someone else's point of view brings us closer to real change." By now, the audience was fully engaged, hanging on every word. There was a palpable sense of connection in the room, as if Karoline had tapped into something deeper, a shared desire for unity and progress. Even Stewart appeared to soften, his usual sarcasm giving way to genuine curiosity. "So you're saying it's possible?" he asked, his tone softer now. "Even in today's climate?" "I believe it is," Karoline replied, her voice filled with conviction. "It won't be easy and it won't happen quickly. But if we give up before we even try, then we've already failed, and I refuse to accept that." The room fell silent, for a brief moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, slowly, the audience began to clap. Not the polite applause from earlier, but a thunderous ovation that seemed to echo through the studio. For Karoline, it wasn't just validation of her argument. It was proof that she had connected with people on a human level, and for Jon Stewart, it was a reminder of why debates like this mattered: to challenge assumptions, spark conversations, and inspire action. As the segment neared its halfway mark, it was clear that something extraordinary was unfolding. This wasn't just a clash of opinions. It was a meeting of minds, a chance to explore complex issues with honesty and heart. And Karoline Leavitt was proving that she wasn't just a participant in the conversation, she was leading it. The energy in the studio was electric, and it was impossible to ignore the shift that had taken place. Jon Stewart, usually the one steering the ship with his quick wit and sharp humor, found himself sharing the spotlight with someone who wasn't just keeping up. She was thriving. Karoline Leavitt's calm confidence and thoughtful responses had turned what could have been a one-sided interview into a genuine exchange of ideas. The audience was no longer just spectators. They were participants, reacting to every twist and turn of the conversation. Stewart leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his expression more serious now. "All right," he said, his tone deliberate. "Let's get personal for a moment. Why does this issue matter so much to you? I mean, why are you putting yourself out there like this? Most people avoid these kinds of debates altogether." Karoline hesitated for just a second, her gaze dropping briefly as if she were gathering her thoughts. When she looked up again, her eyes carried a quiet intensity. "Because I've seen what happens when we don't talk about these things," she said, softly. "I grew up in a small town where resources were scarce and opportunities felt even scarcer. People worked hard, but they were often stuck in cycles they couldn't break, whether it was poverty, lack of education, or just feeling invisible. And I realized early on that change doesn't happen unless someone speaks up." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "For me, this isn't about politics or policies. It's about people, real people with real struggles. If I can use my voice to help even one person feel heard or inspire someone else to take action, then it's worth it. That's why I'm here." The room went silent for a beat, the kind of silence that comes when something deeply human resonates with everyone present. Then, almost instinctively, the audience began to clap, not the loud, enthusiastic applause from before, but a softer, more reflective kind of appreciation. It was clear that Karoline had struck a nerve, not just with her arguments but with her vulnerability. Even Stewart seemed momentarily disarmed. "That's powerful," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But let's be honest, speaking up also means facing criticism. A lot of it. People will call you naive, accuse you of having an agenda, maybe even attack you personally. How do you deal with that?" Karoline nodded, acknowledging the reality of his question. "It's not easy," she admitted. "There are days when the negativity feels overwhelming, when you start questioning whether it's all worth it. But then I remind myself why I started in the first place. I think about the stories I've heard, the faces I've seen, the single mom working 2 jobs to give her kids a better life, the teenager dreaming of college despite all the odds stacked against them. Those are the moments that keep me going." She smiled faintly, her voice steady. "And honestly, criticism is part of the process. If you're not pissing someone off, you're probably not doing enough. Change is uncomfortable, and people push back because they're scared. But fear shouldn't stop us from trying to make things better." Stewart chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "You're relentless, aren't you?" he said, half joking but clearly impressed. "Most people would crumble under that kind of pressure, but you seem to thrive on it. I wouldn't say I thrive on it, Karoline replied with a laugh, but I've learned to embrace it. Every challenge is an opportunity to grow, to refine your message, to connect with people who might not have listened otherwise. And honestly, it's the people who inspire me, the ones who reach out to say thank you for saying what I couldn't. Those moments make everything worth it. The audience erupted into applause again, their cheers louder and more sustained this time. It was clear that Karoline wasn't just winning the debate, she was winning hearts. Her authenticity was undeniable, and it gave her words a weight that facts and figures alone could never achieve. Stewart, too, seemed to recognize this. He glanced at her with a mix of admiration and curiosity, as if seeing her in a new light. "All right," he said after a moment, his tone shifting back to playful, but still earnest. "Let's tackle one last thing before we wrap this up. You've talked a lot about hope, about progress, about listening to each other, but let's be real. How do we know any of this will actually work? What's the end game here?" Karoline didn't skip a beat. "The end game," she said firmly, "isn't perfection. It's improvement. We won't solve every problem overnight, and we'll probably make mistakes along the way. But if we can move the needle even a little, if we can create a system where more people have access to opportunities, where communities feel safer and stronger, then we've succeeded. Progress isn't a destination. It's a journey." Her answer hung in the air, simple yet profound. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Stewart seemed lost in thought, his usual quick retorts replaced by a rare moment of reflection. Then, slowly, he smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that said more than words ever could. "You know," he said finally, leaning toward her, "you're good at this. Really good. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Karoline laughed, brushing off the compliment with a modest shrug. "Thanks," she said. "But honestly, this isn't about me. It's about all of us. If we want to see real change, we have to do it together." As the segment drew to a close, the atmosphere in the studio was nothing short of electric. The audience was on their feet, clapping and cheering, their enthusiasm spilling over into the aisles. For Karoline, it was more than just a victory. It was validation of everything she stood for. She had come to the show prepared to defend her views, but she left having sparked something far greater, a sense of hope, a belief in the power of dialogue, and a reminder that progress starts with ordinary people willing to stand up and speak out. Jon Stewart wrapped up the segment with his signature charm, thanking Karoline for her time and insights. But as the cameras cut to commercial, the buzz backstage told its own story. Staff members whispered excitedly about what had just unfolded, while social media lit up with clips of the debate. Karoline, meanwhile, took a deep breath, allowing herself a quiet moment to process everything. She knew this was just the beginning, but for now she allowed herself to feel proud of what she had accomplished. As the debate rolled into its final stretch, Jon Stewart shifted gears once again. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a thoughtful expression. The playful smirk that had dominated much of the conversation softened, replaced by something deeper, a look of genuine curiosity mixed with respect. "All right," he said, his tone more serious now. "Let's talk about leadership. You've mentioned it a few times, how leaders need to set the tone, bring people together, all that good stuff. But here's the thing. What happens when the leaders themselves are part of the problem? When they're more interested in scoring points than solving problems?" Karoline didn't hesitate. She had clearly anticipated this question, and her response came out steady and measured. "That's a fair point," she said, nodding slightly. "And honestly, I think we're seeing that play out right now in a lot of places. Leaders who prioritize their own agendas over the needs of the people, they're not leading. They're dividing. And when that happens, it's up to the rest of us to step up." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Leadership isn't just about titles or positions. It's about action. It's about everyday people deciding to do the right thing, even when it's hard. A teacher staying late to help a struggling student, a neighbor organizing a food drive, a community coming together to clean up a park. Those are acts of leadership too. Change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it starts at the grassroots level. The audience nodded along, visibly moved by her perspective. Stewart, however, wasn't done yet. "But how realistic is that?" he pressed. "I mean, sure, grassroots movements are great, but they take time. They're slow. Meanwhile, the big decisions, the ones that affect millions, are still being made by the same people you're saying aren't doing enough. Isn't that frustrating?" Karoline smiled faintly, as if she'd been waiting for him to ask exactly that. "Of course it's frustrating," she admitted. "Anyone who says otherwise is lying. But frustration doesn't have to paralyze us. It can fuel us. Look at history. So many of the biggest changes started small. Women's suffrage, civil rights, environmental protections. They didn't happen overnight. People kept pushing, kept believing, even when it felt impossible. And eventually those small efforts added up to something huge." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate as she spoke. "The truth is, we can't wait for perfect conditions or ideal leaders to show up. If we did, nothing would ever get done. Progress is messy, and it's slow, but it's worth it. Every march, every protest, every conversation, it all matters. Even if you don't see the results immediately, trust that you're planting seeds. Someone else will water them, and one day they'll grow." The audience erupted into applause again, their cheers echoing through the studio. It was clear that Karoline's message was resonating deeply, not just because of what she was saying, but because of how she was saying it. She wasn't lecturing or preaching, she was speaking from the heart, sharing truths that felt both personal and universal. Even Stewart seemed struck by the sincerity in her voice. "All right," he said, after a moment, leaning forward again. "Let's say someone watching this right now agrees with you. They want to make a difference, but they don't know where to start. What advice would you give them?" Karoline thought for a second, her expression softening. "Start small," she said simply. "You don't have to change the world overnight. Maybe it's volunteering at a local shelter or mentoring a young person, or even just having honest conversations with your friends and family. Change begins with connection, with understanding each other's stories and finding common ground. So listen, really listen, and then, when you're ready, take action. Whatever feels meaningful to you, whatever aligns with your values. That's where you start." Her answer was simple, yet powerful. It wasn't about grand gestures or heroic feats. It was about the everyday choices that add up to something bigger. The audience responded with another round of applause, this one tinged with a sense of hope and possibility. For many of them, Karoline's words weren't just inspiring, they were actionable. She had given them permission to believe that they too could be agents of change. Stewart watched the reaction unfold, clearly impressed. "You know," he said, his tone lighter now, "you should really write a book or something, seriously. This whole start small, dream big thing, you're onto something." Karoline laughed, brushing off the compliment with a modest shrug. "Maybe someday," she said. "But for now, I'm happy just having conversations like this. If I can inspire even one person to take a step toward making things better, then I've done my job." The segment was nearing its end, but the energy in the room showed no signs of fading. The audience was fully invested, their applause and cheers growing louder with each passing moment. Stewart glanced at the clock, then back at Karoline, clearly reluctant to wrap things up. "Well," he said finally, "we're almost out of time, but I have to say, you've made some excellent points tonight. And you've handled yourself incredibly well. Not everyone can go toe-to-toe with me and come out looking this good." Karoline grinned, her confidence shining through. "Thanks," she said. "But honestly, this isn't about winning or losing. It's about having real conversations about things that matter. If we can walk away from this feeling a little more informed, or maybe even a little more hopeful, then I think we've both done our jobs." Stewart nodded, his trademark grin returning. "Couldn't have said it better myself." He turned to the audience, gesturing toward Karoline. "Give it up one more time for our guest tonight. She's earned it." The applause was thunderous, filling the studio with an energy that felt almost electric. As the cameras cut to commercial, Karoline took a deep breath, allowing herself a quiet moment to process everything that had just happened. She knew this was more than just a TV appearance. It was a chance to spark meaningful conversations, to remind people that their voices mattered. And judging by the reaction in the room, she had succeeded. Backstage, the buzz was palpable. Crew members congratulated her, producers praised her poise, and social media feeds began lighting up with clips of the debate. For Karoline, it was validation of her hard work and dedication, but more importantly, it was proof that courage and conviction could break through even the toughest barriers, including sitting across from a legend like Jon Stewart. The applause hadn't even died down when Jon Stewart turned to Karoline with a mischievous glint in his eye. "All right," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Let's get into something a little more controversial." The audience perked up immediately, sensing that the debate was about to take another dramatic turn. "You've talked a lot about hope and progress, but critics might say you're being overly optimistic. Some would argue that optimism is fine for speeches and sound bites, but it doesn't hold up in the real world. What do you say to that?" Karoline didn't blink. She had been expecting this line of questioning, and her response came out steady and thoughtful. "I understand where they're coming from," she began, her tone calm but firm. "Optimism without action is empty. It's just wishful thinking. But here's the thing. Pessimism without action is worse. It paralyzes us. It makes us believe that nothing we do matters, so why bother trying? And that mindset? That's dangerous." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Yes, the world is messy, and problems are complicated. But if we only focus on what's wrong, we miss opportunities to fix things. Optimism isn't about ignoring reality. It's about believing that we have the power to shape it. It's saying, this is hard, but we can figure it out. And history shows us that when people come together with determination and purpose, incredible things happen." Her answer resonated deeply with the audience, who erupted into applause yet again. Even Stewart seemed momentarily at a loss for words, a rare sight for someone known for always having a clever comeback ready. He tilted his head slightly, studying her as if seeing her in a new light. "That's an interesting way to frame it," he admitted. "But let me push back a bit. Isn't there a risk of setting people up for disappointment? If we promise change and then fail to deliver, doesn't that erode trust?" Karoline nodded, acknowledging the validity of his point. "Absolutely," she said. "False promises are toxic. People deserve honesty, not sugar-coated platitudes, but real talk about what's possible and what will take work. And yes, sometimes we'll fall short. That's part of the process. But failing doesn't mean giving up. It means learning, adjusting, and trying again." She leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. "Think about it this way. Every movement, every breakthrough we celebrate today started with failure. Women fought for decades before getting the right to vote. Civil rights activists faced unimaginable resistance before achieving landmark victories. Scientists failed thousands of times before inventing life-changing technologies. Progress isn't linear. It's messy, painful, and full of setbacks. But if those people had given up after their first failure, where would we be now?" Her passion was unmistakable, and it was impossible not to feel inspired by her conviction. The audience responded with cheers and whistles, their energy infectious. Stewart, too, seemed genuinely moved, though he couldn't resist throwing in one last jab. "You make it sound so easy," he quipped, half smiling. "Just keep going no matter what. But let's be honest, most people don't have your stamina. Or your patience," Karoline laughed, shaking her head. "Trust me, I'm not superhuman," she said. "There are days when I want to throw in the towel, when the negativity feels overwhelming. But I remind myself of two things. First, I'm not alone. There are millions of people out there fighting for the same goals, even if we don't always see them. And second, progress isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. You don't have to win every battle to make a difference. Sometimes just staying in the fight is enough. Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. For many in the audience, it was a reminder that they weren't alone in their struggles, that others shared their frustrations and hopes. Stewart sat back in his chair, nodding slowly. "You know," he said, his tone softer now, "you should bottle whatever it is you're selling because it's working." The room erupted into laughter and applause, the tension of the debate melting away into a shared sense of admiration. Karoline smiled warmly, clearly touched by the response. "It's not about me," she said, "it's about all of us. If my voice can inspire someone else to speak up or take action, then I've done my job." As the segment approached its final moments, Stewart glanced at the clock, then back at Karoline. "Well," he said, his tone lighter but still sincere, "we're almost out of time, but I have to say, you've made some excellent points tonight, and you've handled yourself incredibly well. Not everyone can go toe-to-toe with me and come out looking this good." Karoline grinned, brushing off the compliment with characteristic modesty. "Thanks," she said. "But honestly, this isn't about winning or losing. It's about having real conversations about things that matter. If we can walk away from this feeling a little more informed, or maybe even a little more hopeful, then I think we've both done our jobs." Stewart nodded, his trademark grin returning. "Couldn't have said it better myself." He turned to the audience, gesturing toward Karoline. "Give it up one more time for our guest tonight. She's earned it." The applause was thunderous, filling the studio with an energy that felt almost electric. As the cameras cut to commercial, Karoline took a deep breath, allowing herself a quiet moment to process everything that had just happened. She knew this was more than just a TV appearance. It was a chance to spark meaningful conversations, to remind people that their voices mattered, and judging by the reaction in the room, she had succeeded. Backstage, the buzz was palpable. Crew members congratulated her, producers praised her poise, and social media feeds began lighting up with clips of the debate. For Karoline, it was validation of her hard work and dedication. But more importantly, it was proof that courage and conviction could break through even the toughest barriers, including sitting across from a legend like Jon Stewart. As she walked off the set, she couldn't help but smile. This wasn't the end of the road, it was just the beginning. Her message had reached millions, and she knew that somewhere out there someone was watching and feeling inspired to take action. That, to her, was the true measure of success. As the debate wound down, there was a noticeable shift in the room. The tension that had fueled the earlier parts of the conversation softened, replaced by a sense of mutual respect and shared purpose. Jon Stewart leaned back in his chair, his usual playful smirk replaced with a thoughtful expression. He looked at Karoline not as an opponent but as someone who had genuinely challenged him, and maybe even made him think twice about some things. "You know," he said, breaking the brief silence after the applause died down, "I've done hundreds of interviews over the years, and I can count on one hand the number of guests who've managed to surprise me. You're definitely one of them." His tone was warm, almost fatherly, like he was giving her a compliment she hadn't expected but fully deserved. Karoline chuckled softly, clearly caught off guard by the sincerity of his words. "Wow," she said, shaking her head slightly. "That's probably the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me after grilling me for half an hour." The audience laughed along with her, their laughter mingling with lingering admiration. Stewart joined in, nodding. "Hey, it's not every day you meet someone who can keep up with my nonsense and make me question my own assumptions," he admitted. "Seriously, though, how do you stay so calm under pressure? Most people would have crumbled by now." Karoline thought for a moment before answering. She folded her hands on the desk in front of her, her posture relaxed but deliberate. "Honestly, I don't think about it too much while it's happening," she said. "When you're passionate about something, it doesn't feel like work. It feels like a conversation. And conversations are supposed to be messy, right? They're supposed to challenge us, push us out of our comfort zones. If I let myself get overwhelmed by nerves or fear, then I'm not doing justice to the topic or the people listening." Her answer was simple, yet it carried a weight that resonated deeply with the audience. They weren't just hearing her talk about staying, Composed, they were seeing proof of it right in front of them. Stewart nodded slowly, clearly impressed. "That's a good way to look at it," he said. "But let's be real. Most people aren't built like you. What advice would you give to someone who wants to speak up, but is scared of being judged or criticized?" Karoline didn't hesitate. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and full of conviction. "First, remind yourself why you're speaking up in the first place," she said. "If your goal is to help others, to make life better for someone, even if it's just one person, then criticism doesn't matter as much. It still stings, sure, but it doesn't define you. Second, surround yourself with people who believe in you. Having a support system makes all the difference when things get tough. And finally, remember this. No one has all the answers. You don't have to be perfect to make a difference. You just have to be willing to try." Her words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. For many in the audience, they felt like permission to step out of the shadows, to use their voices, to take risks even when failure seemed likely. Stewart sat quietly for a moment, letting the impact of her response settle. Then, with a small smile, he added, "You sound like you've been through this before." Karoline laughed softly, nodding. "Oh, absolutely," she admitted. "There have been plenty of times when I've doubted myself, when the negativity felt overwhelming. But each time, I reminded myself of two things. First, that I'm not alone. There are always people rooting for me, even if I can't see them. And second, that change starts with courage. Sometimes just showing up is enough." The audience erupted into applause again, their cheers echoing through the studio. This wasn't just a victory lap. It was a collective acknowledgement of what they'd witnessed. A young woman standing firm in her beliefs, refusing to back down and inspiring others to do the same. Even Stewart seemed moved, his playful banter giving way to genuine admiration. "Well," he said finally, leaning back in his chair, "I think you've officially earned your spot in the legendary Guest Hall of Fame. Not many people leave here having changed the way I look at things, but you've done exactly that." Karoline smiled, brushing off the praise with characteristic humility. "Thanks, but honestly, this isn't about me," she said. "It's about starting conversations that matter. If I've inspired even one person tonight to think differently or to take action, then I've done my job." Stewart raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. "Well, based on the reaction in this room, I'd say you've inspired a lot more than one person," he said, gesturing toward the cheering audience. "And judging by the way social media is blowing up, I wouldn't be surprised if this becomes one of the most talked about episodes we've ever done." For a brief moment, Karoline allowed herself to soak it all in. The applause, the compliments, the realization that her message had reached far beyond the confines of the studio. But she quickly brought herself back to earth, reminding herself of the bigger picture. "That's amazing to hear," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "But for me, the real win is knowing that these conversations are happening. That people are thinking, talking, and hopefully taking steps toward making things better." As the segment drew to a close, Stewart turned to the audience one last time. "All right, folks, that's all the time we have for tonight," he announced, his tone upbeat but sincere. "But trust me when I say this, you don't want to miss keeping an eye on our guest. She's got big things ahead of her, and I can't wait to see where she goes from here." The applause swelled once more, louder and more sustained than ever before. Karoline stood up, shaking Stewart's hand and waving to the audience as she stepped away from the desk. Backstage, the energy was electric. Crew members rushed up to congratulate her, praising her poise and presence under pressure. Social media feeds were flooded with clips of the debate, hashtags trending as viewers weighed in with their thoughts. For Karoline, it was both exhilarating and humbling. She had walked into the studio hoping to make an impact, but she hadn't anticipated just how profound that impact would be. As she took a quiet moment to reflect, she reminded herself of what mattered most. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about using her platform to spark meaningful change, to remind people that their voices mattered. And judging by the reactions pouring in, she had succeeded in ways she never could have imagined. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. As the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, Karoline took a deep breath. The adrenaline that had carried her through the debate was beginning to fade, leaving behind a quiet sense of accomplishment and exhaustion. She glanced around the bustling backstage area, where crew members were packing up equipment and chatting excitedly about what had just unfolded. For a moment, she allowed herself to step out of the spotlight and simply be present in the aftermath of an unforgettable night. Jon Stewart appeared beside her, his usual confident stride softened by a hint of warmth. "You handled that like a pro," he said, giving her shoulder a friendly pat. "Seriously, you've got a gift. Not everyone can hold their ground like that and still come across as relatable." Karoline smiled, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude. "Thanks for pushing me," she replied honestly. "If anything, this reminded me how important it is to have tough conversations, even when they're uncomfortable." Stewart nodded thoughtfully. "That's the thing about debates like this. They're not just about winning or losing. They're about challenging each other, stretching our perspectives, and maybe even learning something new." He paused, looking at her with genuine admiration. "And tonight I think we both walked away better for it." The sincerity in his words struck a chord with Karoline. It wasn't often that someone as sharp and seasoned as Jon Stewart admitted to being influenced by another person's perspective. But here he was, acknowledging that their exchange had been meaningful, for him as much as for the audience. She felt a surge of validation, not because she'd bested him, but because she'd connected with him on a human level. As they parted ways, Karoline made her way to a small lounge area reserved for guests. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her hand, notifications pouring in from every direction. Social media platforms were ablaze with clips of the debate, hashtags trending as viewers shared their thoughts. Some praised her poise and intelligence. Others highlighted specific moments that resonated with them. One comment stood out. "She reminded me that my voice matters. Thank you for that." Reading those words brought tears to her eyes, not because of vanity, but because of purpose. This was why she did what she did. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about making people feel seen, heard, and empowered to take action. And tonight, she had succeeded in ways that exceeded her wildest expectations. A producer approached her, holding a tablet displaying real-time analytics. "Do you have any idea what's happening out there?" he asked, his tone equal parts excitement and disbelief. "Your name is trending worldwide. People are calling this one of the most impactful episodes we've ever aired." Karoline laughed softly, shaking her head in amazement. "I didn't plan for that," she admitted. "I just wanted to share my perspective and hopefully inspire a few people along the way." "Well, mission accomplished," the producer said with a grin. "You've inspired a lot more than a few." Later that evening, as she sat alone in her hotel room, Karoline reflected on everything that had transpired. The applause, the praise, the viral clips. All of it was thrilling, yes, but none of it compared to the knowledge that she had sparked meaningful conversations. Conversations about hope, resilience, leadership, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. Those were the things that truly mattered. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her mom. "We're so proud of you," it read. "You showed the world who you really are tonight." Karoline smiled, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. Her family had always been her biggest supporters, cheering her on even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Knowing they were watching and celebrating meant the world to her. But as fulfilling as the night had been, Karoline knew this was only the beginning. The attention would eventually die down, the headlines would fade, and life would move forward. What mattered now was what came next. How could she build on this momentum? How could she turn inspiration into action? She grabbed a notebook from her bag and began jotting down ideas. A podcast series featuring everyday heroes making a difference in their communities. A campaign encouraging young people to engage in local politics. Collaborations with organizations working toward causes she cared deeply about. The possibilities felt endless, and she couldn't wait to get started. By the time she finally turned off the light and climbed into bed, exhaustion had taken over. But so had determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new ways to make an impact. And Karoline Leavitt was ready for all of it. When she woke up the next morning, the world looked a little brighter. The sun streamed through the curtains, casting golden light across the room. As she scrolled through her phone, she saw countless messages from strangers thanking her for inspiring them to speak up, to take action, to believe in themselves. Each message reinforced what she already knew. Change starts with courage. And sometimes simply showing up is enough. This was her moment. But more importantly, it was everyone's moment. Because if there was one thing Karoline had learned from her explosive debate with Jon Stewart, it was this. Progress isn't made by lone voices shouting into the void. It's made by millions of voices coming together, refusing to stay silent, and demanding a better future. And Karoline? She was just getting started.